Today it's great to have Dr. Lisa Sheenan. Lisa's Assistant Professor in Banking and Finance in the Smurfit Business School. She's worked as an economist for the Central Bank, risk analyst for Strategic Banking Corporation at the NTMA, and also as Assistant Professor in Finance previously at Queen's University from 2018 to 2024 when she joined us here in UCD, thankfully. It's great to have an expert in this area. She recently contributed to our seminar on the Nature Restoration Plan, looking at the costs and benefits of that. It was a really good session. You can have a look online and see the recording. You'll find it really informative. Today, she'll be talking about carbon debt and what happens when a country's emissions exceed its fair share of the remaining global carbon budget, looking at Ireland as a case study, thinking about climate finance, legal responsibility, and long-term fiscal governance. I'd love to stay, but I have to go to another meeting. But I'll hand over to Lisa. I'm sure it'll be a really good session, and I will have a look at the video later.
Thanks, Owen. Thank you. So, just before we start, I'll just give you a very brief background. Owen did most of it there for me, but just so you can kind of see where I'm coming from with this research. So what I'm going to present today, it's very early stage research. And I'm trying to give a very high level because I only have 10 minutes. So yeah, my background is pure finance. From 2014, I got my PhD. And did, kind of normal traditional finance, was interested in risk spillovers and contagion and things like that. And then around 2020, I started to get involved in nature finance on funded projects up in Queen's with the School of Biological Sciences. So since then, I've gotten really interested in, they call it green finance, but, it's nature restoration. How are we going to fund this? How can we, stimulate investment in these areas? So I'm part of a few funded projects, the Co-Centre for Climate plus Biodiversity plus Water, and through that I've done the work on the NRP. Now, last year I did a Master's in Environmental and Climate Law in the School of Law here at UCD with Andrew Jackson. So he's another member of the Earth Institute. So this at the top was what I originally told Will I was going to present on today when we talked months ago, but I'm going to focus in on, this is the dissertation I did for that Master's. At the moment, we're working to get it together as a paper to submit to an interdisciplinary journal. So we're going to talk about Ireland's fair share carbon budget, and we're linking the legal and the financial aspects of those together. So it's myself, it's Andrew, and we have Aideen O'Doherty. I think a few people here know Aideen. She's from DCU. So there's probably people here who know a lot more about this than I do in terms of carbon budgets, and I know they can be contested as well. So before we start, I want to say the reason I'm interested in these would be because coming from a finance background and doing this interdisciplinary work, I have found it difficult at meetings. Sometimes we're talking in different languages, and we end up talking about the same thing, but we don't really realize that. And also we know that this challenge will take a massive behavioral change. But we also know that people are fatigued listening to this, carbon's gone up. Okay, well, whatever, everyone's kind of got their own stuff going on, but we know that we need to try and get people on board. So with carbon budgets, the way I'm thinking of it is, can we use this as a framework to try to communicate to people this issue in a different way? So to try to link climate science with economics, with finance. So to try to kind of spurn that behavioral change. So as I said, I'm sure there's people here who know a lot more than I do about this. But this is the basic idea underpinning the paper. We know that the atmosphere has finite capacity to absorb carbon dioxide if we are to remain within the temperature limits under internationally agreed thresholds. So here from the IPCC, from 2020, the remaining carbon budget for a 50% of chance of limiting warming to 1.5 is about 500 gigatons of CO2. Now, this is I got this last night, so this is more updated. You can't see it very well, probably from where you are, but it's not good. Okay, so we know this. We know that the remaining carbon budget is very, very small, and we have to think about ways to try to overcome this, or to try and do something. I don't think there will be, unfortunately, a solution, but that's where I'm coming at this kind of communication and how we can use these frameworks. And they are being used increasingly in climate science and in policy to try to link climate science to, like I said, policy and to finance. And that's what we're trying to do today. So if we have this finite global carbon budget, then a governance question emerges. So what, in our case, is Ireland's fair share of this budget? And there are different ways of determining this in the literature. What we use is a population model. So very straightforward. We're at the first stage of the paper, basically. But we know that you can include things like economic capacity, historical emissions, development needs, and things like that. And that would be our next step. So what would Ireland's fair share of this budget be? So why does fair share matter? So in this capacity, what we're thinking about is under a fair share approach, the question is not what a country is doing domestically in terms of climate, not only what they're doing domestically, but how those targets or how those measures contribute to the global carbon budget. Is it a fair contribution? So from the climate science perspective, what we talked about there, we have the finite carbon budget. In terms of climate justice, we know that not all countries will bear the same responsibilities. It will differ across countries. We have different wealth, we have different capacities. We know that. And then that leads us to that question. So the national targets may still be unfair, even if their domestic targets are being met. A country may not be contributing fairly to we don't want them to contribute to the global carbon budget, but they may not be acting in a way that is fair on a global basis. So Ireland is an interesting case study. I'm sure you'll agree. On paper, we have adopted relatively ambitious, on paper at least, I don't know, you might not agree with me, but we have relatively ambitious climate targets. We have, legislation in place. We have these rolling 5-year carbon budgets, and we have a statutory target of reaching net zero by 2050. So that all is positive, and I hope we agree. However, we know that we're among the highest per capita emitters in the EU. So that's us there, just beside Luxembourg. And we know a lot of that comes from agriculture and transport. So we have this, these conflicts. So we have this ambitious, legally binding targets, but we still have this problem in terms of what we're emitting. And it's this conflict between these that interests me and serves as a basis for the work that we're doing. So what would, if we began to think about what Ireland's fair share would be, what do we take into account here? So the work is based on this paper. Aideen is one of the authors of this paper from 2024 with Barry McMullen and Paul Price. So they developed this Paris test with the aim to assess whether Irish emissions pathways are compatible with Paris temperature goals. And they use an equal per capita scaling logic. So they look at Ireland's emissions. It's not a fixed carbon budget or anything for Ireland, but it's how our different pathways would contribute if they were scaled on a global basis. So our research builds on that framework to explore the financial implications of this. So like I said, I don't have time to go into it, but the actual methodology is, of course, very complicated. But the main point is it's not a fixed carbon budget for Ireland that they develop. They're looking at the different pathways and how those emissions will contribute on a global scale. And we're going to build on that. We're at the starting point. So all we're doing at this point is looking at a population basis. So how Ireland's population is relative to the globe. So we get our estimated overshoot first. So this is our carbon debt. So this is how we will communicate this. Okay, so we get this simplified fair share benchmark for Ireland using an equal per capita allocation approach. So based on population. So we start off, we get our projected emissions. These are from EPA estimates to 2030. So between 580 and 630 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Our fair share benchmark, again, only based on population. So this would be a lower bound. We want to include things like economic capacity, but we're starting at the lower bound here. We find about 320. So we get this overshoot between 260 and 310. Again, lower bound. But it's more the conceptualization that I'm interested in, that we can conceptualize this overshoot as a carbon debt. And then the next step, which I'll show you now, is to monetize this in a way that we can then communicate it to policymakers and to society, So we're going to use shadow carbon pricing to do so. So this is not a market price for carbon. It's not like the EU ETS system carbon price. It estimates the cost of achieving emissions reductions consistent with climate targets. And we have different prices in the paper, but for today, because I know I'm already running out of time, I'll show you from the literature, it tends to be between 100 to 200 euro per ton of CO2 equivalent. And you can see when we monetize that, we end up with these figures here. It's an indicative valuation. It's not a legal debt. It's not sitting on a balance sheet somewhere, but it's, again, allows us to begin to think of this, in terms of the government balance sheet. Okay, so I'm going to put the numbers into context here. If we look at the National Development Plan, we see that we have about 167 billion euro between 2021 and 2030 was allocated for planned capital investment. So our estimated carbon debt would be about 15 to 37% of that. So it's a very big number, but it's not outside either of the realms of possibility in terms of the government being able to finance this. So it illustrates the scale of the emissions responsibility. We also did a little bit just in the paper if we looked at repayment periods over 10 years, 25 and 40 years. Obviously, the shorter repayment periods are going to be under a lot of pressure. Fiscally, politically, it wouldn't fly. But if we go into the longer term, we then have to think of issues in terms of climate justice and intergenerational burdens. So what can we do? I'll just wrap up now. I know I've gone over the time, sorry. Possible responses, of course, there's not going to be one single one, but this is where I want to tie everything together. Domestically, we know we need to accelerate decarbonisation and we know the areas that we need to focus on. Carbon removal is obviously going to be important, but there's those technologies, there's a lot of uncertainty around them still, and there's still, of course, matter. So international climate finance, that will be important. Again, it's about changing behavior. People change their behavior a lot quicker when you start to hit them in their pocket, unfortunately. It can be the carrot or the stick. If you do this, I will take some money away from you. Or if you do this, I will subsidize you in some way. In terms of mitigation support, under the Paris Agreement, we have to look as a higher income country at how we can fund adaptation and mitigation in lower income countries. And that is also very important. And really, it's the climate governance then that links all of these together. We need to link the legal with the finance side to try to get towards some possible responses. So key takeaways, again, it's very early stage work, but we're trying to look at carbon budgets not only in a scientific way, but in terms of fairness and responsibility. It looks like, we're going to exceed the Paris-aligned fair share benchmark, and we need to kind of think about how climate finance can play a real role in this rather than, just on paper. If you look at the Paris Agreement, it's really a lot of the language is should do or should look at, we're going to have to do something. It needs to be more concrete. So thank you very much. And there's my email address if anyone wants to email me. Thank you.